The descent onto Mars was as jarring as it was awe-inspiring. The red planet's stark beauty stretched out in all directions, a desolate, sweeping landscape bathed in a pale orange glow. It was like standing on the edge of a dream, if that dream had been conjured from dust and silence. Dr. Elena Vasquez gripped the arms of her seat, her stomach clenching as the capsule touched down, settling uneasily on the uneven terrain. Her breath hitched as she gazed through the thick window, taking in the alien landscape that would be her home for the next 6 months. The rest of the crew worked quietly around her, their movements efficient but edged with an unspoken tension. 7 of them, a hand-picked team of Earth's finest, each member chosen for their expertise, endurance, and adaptability. Elena had trained for this for years, her fascination with life beyond Earth giving her the strength to push through the endless simulations, the endless hours in isolation chambers. And now here she was, standing on Mars. Camp Argos is up and running, her colleague Dr. Patel announced as he began unsealing the hatch. Let's get our boots on Mars. Elena, along with the others, suited up quickly. The suits were bulky but necessary. The Martian atmosphere was a hostile cocktail of thin air, frigid temperatures, and cosmic radiation. Each step was a reminder of their vulnerability, of the need for caution. As they emerged from the capsule, the landscape seemed to breathe around them, a vast, empty desert painted in muted reds and ochres. But it wasn't the colors or the emptiness that unsettled Elena. It was the quiet. Mars's silence was oppressive, an endless void that absorbed sound, movement, even thought. Here there were no echoes, no vibrations, only the heavy weight of solitude. The camp itself was a modest series of connected domes, one for living quarters, one for scientific research, and another for medical and emergency supplies. Metal walkways connected each module, sterile corridors barely wide enough for one person, designed for functionality rather than comfort. They had all seen the blueprints, trained in mock-up modules, but it felt different now that they were truly cut off from everything familiar. As they settled in, Elena began her work immediately, coordinating with Corporal Harris to catalog samples and prepare for the team's first foray outside the camp. Their objective was simple: find evidence of microbial life, perhaps hidden in the ice deposits or dust-filled crevices of Martian rocks. For Elena, this was the culmination of a lifetime of research. Finding life, even the smallest hint of it, would change humanity's place in the universe forever. "Can you believe it?" she murmured to Harris as they donned their helmets and double-checked their oxygen levels. "All the mystery, all the theories, and here we are about to make history." Harris gave a short laugh, his voice crackling through the comms. "Yeah, history. Let's just hope we make it back to tell people about it." Outside the safety of Camp Argos, Mars was even more unforgiving. The wind carried fine particles that scraped at their visors, the ground uneven and littered with jagged rocks. They spent hours collecting samples, their movements slow and careful, ever mindful of their equipment and surroundings. Yet, as they worked, Elena couldn't shake an odd sensation, the prickling awareness that they were not alone. Each time she glanced back at the camp, she half expected to see something lurking just beyond her line of sight, a shadow in the dust. But each time she found only her own fear reflected back at her in the desolate landscape. When they finally returned to the safety of the domes, Elena felt relief wash over her, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, after cataloging their findings, she couldn't resist the urge to peer out the small window beside her bunk. The Martian night was black as ink, devoid of any stars or comforting landmarks. She stared into the void, her mind racing with images of things unseen, of shapes moving just beyond the light's reach. Dr. Patel had set up the initial scans of her samples, and by the next morning, Elena felt the familiar thrill of discovery pulling her from her restless thoughts. Under the microscope, the sample displayed unusual characteristics. At first, it seemed to contain nothing more than minute particles of dust and mineral traces. But as she increased the magnification, she caught a glimpse of something peculiar. An organic cell structure, shifting as if it were alive. Her pulse quickened. "Dr. Patel, come look at this." He leaned in, eyes narrowing as he observed the screen. The cells were small, translucent, but they moved with a strange fluidity, a sense of purpose that sent a chill down her spine. "Are they reacting to us?" Patel's voice held a note of disbelief. She nodded, captivated. "It's like they're aware." It was an impossible conclusion, yet the cells continued to shift under the lens, as if in response to their gaze. They divided and reformed, adapting with a speed that bordered on sentience. Every scientific instinct in Elena's mind fired off warnings, but a deeper fascination held her in place, a need to understand whatever lay hidden within this alien material. But as night fell again, that nagging sense of dread returned. There was something about these cells, something that hinted at a purpose darker than simple survival. As Elena stared once more into the Martian night, the weight of isolation pressed down on her, her own pulse thrumming in time with the faint, indiscernible rhythms of the alien cells. For the first time in her career, she felt genuine fear, a primal instinct that whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." The sense of being watched grew unbearable, stretching into an unseen presence that seemed to curl around the camp itself. And in that silence, that suffocating emptiness, Elena understood with chilling clarity that Mars was not a place meant to be touched, explored, or even understood. It was a tomb, and they were the intruders. As she lay in her bunk, the oppressive quiet was broken by a faint, rhythmic tapping against the wall beside her. She froze, heart racing, listening as the tapping grew louder, each beat pounding in sync with her fear. The sound moved, tracing along the edges of the dome like something testing, probing, seeking a way inside. And as she finally drifted into a fitful sleep, that single thought echoed in her mind. Mars does not want us here. Elena jolted awake, heart hammering in her chest, as her eyes adjusted to the cold, dim light inside the camp. The Martian night had settled heavily over Camp Argos, casting an eerie stillness across the compound. She reached instinctively for the comm link on her wrist, blinking as the time came into focus. It was already well past the designated morning roll call. A quick glance around her quarters confirmed the unsettling emptiness. She pulled herself up and drifted through the narrow hallways, searching for any sign of her colleagues. Most of the crew had gathered in the common area, faces pale and anxious. But one face was missing, Corporal Harris. She knew before anyone said it, felt it in the heavy silence that gripped the room. Corporal Harris was gone. Dr. Patel was the first to voice what they were all thinking, his voice low and uncertain. "I checked the secondary modules, the storage units. There's no trace of him. No sign of a struggle, no emergency beacon. He just vanished. Elena's mind spun. Protocol forbade anyone from leaving the safety of Camp Argos unaccompanied, especially at night. The Martian environment was too hostile, and the camp's security protocols were designed to alert them of any unauthorized departure. And yet, Harris had disappeared without a trace, without so much as a comlink ping or distress signal. "He didn't leave through the main hatch," murmured Dr. Rowe, the camp medic, scanning the room with wild, terrified eyes. I checked. Everything was sealed. It's like he was taken. The word taken hung in the air, heavy and unnatural. An unspoken dread passed between them, a realization that felt like ice creeping down their spines. They had come to Mars prepared for isolation, for danger, even for the relentless psychological toll of being stranded millions of miles from Earth. But nothing had prepared them for the creeping fear that something somehow was watching them. "We need to organize a search," Elena said, forcing a steadiness into her voice she did not feel. "Check every module, every storage unit, every corner. He couldn't have just disappeared." But as the hours dragged on, their search yielded nothing. The dread deepened, settling in their bones. Elena's mind flickered back to the night before, to that soft, persistent tapping outside her wall. The memory clawed its way back, sending a shiver down her spine. Had it been a malfunction? A trick of the mind? Or had it been something else? As night crept closer, unease seeped into every interaction, every glance exchanged between them. Elena could see it in their eyes, a slowly mounting terror, an unspoken knowledge that Harris was not coming back. The idea of locking themselves away for another Martian night felt like willingly stepping into a cage with a predator they could not see. After another futile search, Elena ordered a lockdown. "Until we figure out what happened, no one leaves the main module alone. We need to be vigilant, work in pairs, and report any strange findings immediately." She could feel her own fear bleeding through her voice, but she pressed on, forcing the words out as if saying them would impose some form of control over their spiraling situation. That night, the crew gathered in the common area, sleeping in shifts, each of them armed with makeshift tools, a wrench, a rod, anything that might ward off the invisible threat pressing down on them. The air inside the camp was thick with silence, broken only by nervous breathing and the occasional rustle as someone shifted in their seat. And then, just as Elena's shift was about to end, the tapping returned. It started faintly, a soft but persistent beat against the outer wall. The sound moved slowly, tracing along the perimeter of the dome, seeming to pause at every panel, every bolt. Elena felt her heart rate spike, every instinct screaming at her to stay still, to stay silent. She wasn't alone in hearing it. The others had tensed as well, their eyes wide and fearful, listening to the relentless tapping that seemed to move closer and closer, as if searching for a way in. Dr. Rowe, sitting closest to the wall, reached out a trembling hand, pressing his ear against the cold metal. His eyes darted to Elena, filled with a mixture of horror and disbelief. It's alive," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. The tapping stopped. A collective breath was held, every person frozen, waiting, listening. And then, in the silence, something heavier, a soft scraping, began to echo through the camp. Elena felt her mouth go dry as she turned toward the sound. The lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe, stretching into grotesque forms that mocked their sense of reality. She could almost feel the presence outside, like a dense, unseen weight pressing against the thin walls of their sanctuary. A soft, metallic creak sounded from the corner of the room. Slowly, her eyes fixed on a small air vent, barely large enough for a hand to slip through, but it was vibrating. Just barely, but enough to confirm their worst fears. Whatever was outside was testing the camp, probing for weaknesses, a silent predator stalking its prey. Elena's thoughts raced. Harris's disappearance, the unexplained tapping, the strange movements outside, none of it made any sense. Mars was supposed to be barren, lifeless, a frozen desert of rock and dust. Yet here they were, plagued by something that defied reason, something that lurked in the shadows, that could take a grown man without a trace. In desperation, Dr. Patel tried the emergency comms again, his voice cracking as he repeated their distress call. But the only reply was static, the cold, uncaring void of space. "Earth isn't responding," he said finally, slumping in defeat. "We're on our own." The tension was now a palpable force, pressing in from every corner. One by one, the crew drifted into fitful sleep, clinging to each other like frightened children. Elena stayed awake, eyes fixed on the small, reinforced window. She tried to tell herself it was just a creature's instinct, perhaps some unknown Martian life form, mindlessly testing the boundaries of its territory. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It was patient. It was intelligent. As dawn broke over Mars, bathing the camp in a pale, ghostly light, Elena felt a flicker of relief, only to have it snatched away by a sickening discovery. In the morning light, they could finally see outside, tracks in the dust, winding around the camp in strange, looping patterns. The tracks were shallow, winding, and twisting, but they led away from the dome and into the open Martian landscape. And at the edge of the tracks, half buried in the dust, lay Harris's helmet. Visor cracked, a faint trace of dark stains smeared across its surface. They gathered around it in silence, the reality settling over them like a shroud. There would be no rational explanation, no comforting answers. Whatever was out there had taken Harris, and now it was coming for them, circling in the shadows, waiting for the night to descend once again. They returned to the common area, barricading themselves inside as best as they could, each of them avoiding the other's gaze, the weight of unspoken terror filling every breath. The tracks outside were just the beginning. They all knew it. Mars was no longer the barren, lifeless landscape they'd expected. It was a hunting ground, and they were the prey. As night descended once more, the last of the sunlight fading to a cold, eerie glow, Elena clutched her makeshift weapon tighter. She could feel the oppressive silence settling over the camp again, thick and suffocating. The others around her were tense, eyes darting, waiting for the tapping to return. They were no longer scientists, explorers, or pioneers. They were survivors, trapped in the middle of a nightmare with no escape, their fates bound to the silent, indifferent planet they had come to conquer. And as the last glimmer of light slipped beneath the horizon, Elena knew one thing with certainty. Mars was not a place they could understand, control, or even survive. It was a place that would claim them, one by one, until there was no one left to hear their final screams. The air inside Camp Argos grew colder as the days wore on, a creeping chill that seemed to seep through the walls, soaking into their bones. Elena found herself staring at the dwindling oxygen levels on her monitor, knowing they had enough reserves for several weeks, but feeling the suffocating claustrophobia nonetheless. The days were blending together, a constant cycle of anxiety and exhausted vigilance, punctuated by the endless echoing silence of the Martian plains. And then, the breach happened. Dr. Patel was the first to notice it. His sharp intake of breath drew everyone's attention as he peered down a narrow corridor leading to the secondary storage module, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Everyone, come here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The rest of the crew gathered around him, exchanging uneasy glances before they followed his gaze. The corridor's end lay in shadows, cast by the dim emergency lights they had been forced to rely on. And there, in the shadowed metal wall, was a tear, a jagged, unnatural hole. What? How? Corporal Mason's voice was taut, a thin thread of control holding back panic. That polymer can withstand asteroid impacts. Elena stepped closer, examining the edges of the breach. The material wasn't punctured in the usual way. It was melted, twisted at the edges, as if something corrosive had eaten through it, something powerful enough to breach the supposedly indestructible walls. Her mind raced, unable to reconcile what she was seeing. This was more than an intrusion. It was a message. Whatever had done this wanted them to know it could. The breach hadn't set off any alarms, no atmospheric warnings, nothing. It was as if Mars itself had willed the hole into existence, a gap through which the freezing air and the strange, dust-laden silence of the planet could seep in, clawing at the thin veil that kept them alive. Elena touched the edge of the breach, her gloved hand barely brushing the twisted polymer. The material crumbled slightly, flaking off like charred paper. She jerked her hand back, heart pounding. "Patel, see if you can scan for contaminants," she ordered, her voice shaky but determined. They had to find answers, some logical explanation, anything to understand what was happening to them. Patel set up the scanner, his movements mechanical and unsteady, as if every part of him resisted what he was seeing. The small screen flickered, casting pale green light onto their faces as it began its work. But the longer they watched, the stranger the readings became. Radiation levels spiked erratically, and the scanner registered an anomaly in the surrounding air, something it could detect but could not define. "I don't understand," Patel murmured, staring at the screen as if it held a secret he was afraid to uncover. "There's something here, but the scanner can't analyze it. It's beyond our equipment's range." Elena clenched her fists, frustration and dread mingling into a raw, pulsing terror. How could something evade the very technology they'd been assured was foolproof? How could anything native to Mars exhibit such intelligence? As the hours passed, their hope of repairing the breach waned. Patel tried every adhesive, every sealant, but the damaged area continued to deteriorate, as if the metal itself had been poisoned, weakening by the second. It was the first time since landing on Mars that Elena felt the full weight of their helplessness. The breach was spreading, and with it, an encroaching sense of doom. They agreed to seal off the corridor leading to the secondary storage, isolating the compromised area, hoping it would contain whatever corrosive force was at work. But as they barricaded the entrance, Dr. Rowe pointed out something they'd missed in the chaos. "Look at the pattern around the breach," he whispered, voice hollow. "It's not random." Elena squinted, staring at the fine, almost invisible etchings around the hole. They weren't cracks or fractures, they were marks, carved into the metal in thin, twisting lines. The pattern spiraled outward like veins spreading from a wound, extending into the walls and ceiling. The realization hit her like a blow. The marks weren't just random scratches. They were deliberate, an alien language carved in silence. In the following hours, paranoia settled into their minds, thick and oppressive. The breach was a warning, an insidious display of power. It was intelligent, purposeful. Whatever was out there wanted them to feel its presence, to understand that it was capable of tearing down the very walls they had relied on for survival. Elena felt her grip on logic fraying, her scientist's mind strained under the weight of the unexplainable. That night, they huddled together in the main module, the walls seeming thinner and more vulnerable than ever. No one slept. Each of them clutched their makeshift weapons, their eyes darting to every corner, every shadow that seemed to stretch longer and darker with each passing second. As midnight approached, Elena heard it again, the tapping. It echoed through the metal corridors, soft but insistent, each tap carrying the weight of something unnatural, probing, testing, moving closer. The sound slithered along the walls, tracing a path around their makeshift barricade, as if taunting them. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps as she listened, the rhythmic tapping blending with the frantic beating of her heart. She looked around at her crew, their faces twisted in fear. Dr. Patel's eyes were bloodshot, the look of a man who had lost himself to something nameless. Dr. Rowe was muttering to himself, running a hand over his short hair as if trying to reassure himself he was still real, still whole. Then came the sound that made Elena's blood run cold. A slow scraping noise, followed by a low rumbling vibration that resonated through the floor. She gripped her metal rod, eyes wide, every nerve on edge. The sound was moving through the corridors, nearing the main module, a relentless, unyielding approach. With a final shuddering creak, the lights flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. She reached out, grabbing Patel's arm, her voice barely above a whisper. Emergency lights now. The dim red emergency lights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The corridor to the breached module was bathed in a crimson glow, the faint outline of the twisted wall visible, but nothing more. Yet the presence remained, a weight pressing against them, filling the air with a sense of dread so profound it bordered on suffocation. The tapping resumed, louder now, more insistent. It was coming from within the camp. "Everyone back against the wall," Elena whispered, her voice trembling as she guided them away from the corridor. The red lights created an oppressive, hellish glow that threw their shadows against the walls, twisted, distorted, almost alien. And then they saw it, a shape in the darkness, moving with unnatural fluidity, slipping through the corridor toward them. It was barely visible, a shifting, writhing form that seemed to melt and reform, its body twisting in ways that defied logic. As it drew closer, the dim light caught glimpses of its surface. Slick, dark, something between flesh and metal, covered in the same strange, spiraling patterns that marred the walls. The creature paused, tilting what could have been its head, studying them. Its gaze, or whatever passed for one, felt invasive, pressing against their minds like a physical force. Elena felt her body go rigid, her heart pounding so hard it drowned out the sound of the tapping. They were frozen, too terrified to move. And in that agonizing stillness, the creature did something that shattered any remaining illusion of safety. It reached a thin, shimmering appendage out, pressing it against the wall, and began to etch another spiral, its sharp limb carving through metal as if it were paper. Elena's mind struggled to process the horror before her, a scream building in her throat. The creature was writing, marking their walls, their home, with symbols that radiated malice, an ancient language spoken in silence and fear. She felt something cold and foreign creep into her mind, a realization so dark it threatened to consume her. They were not alone, and they never had been. As the creature finished its mark, it slipped back into the shadows, leaving the fresh spiral glowing faintly, almost as if it pulsed with its own sickly light. The silence that followed was heavy, unnatural. Camp Argos had been breached. Its walls, their minds, everything they had relied upon, had been invaded, defiled by a presence they could not understand, a presence that had just declared its intention. They were no longer explorers, scientists, or pioneers. They were trespassers on a land they had never been meant to touch. And as the creature's shadow faded, the truth settled into them with suffocating certainty. Mars was not barren. It was alive, and it had waited centuries to consume those foolish enough to tread on its soil. Elena stared into the crimson dusk, bleeding through the reinforced window of Camp Argos, watching as the thin light sank beneath Mars's barren horizon. The silence pressed down upon her, as if the very air around her had thickened, pooling in her lungs like quicksand. The others were gone, taken one by one. Dr. Patel, Corporal Mason, Dr. Rowe, all vanished into the dark hollows of Mars, claimed by the thing that hunted them, that waited outside with infinite patience, knowing there was nowhere left for her to go. Her hand shook as she gripped the metal rod she had fashioned into a makeshift weapon, knowing it would do nothing against the relentless, alien force that had stalked them from the first night. The rod's cold weight grounded her, the last thing connecting her to some semblance of control. But as she looked around the main module, her fortress turned prison. That control frayed. Only the faint emergency lights remained, casting a weak red glow that seemed to shrink with every passing minute. The symbols were everywhere now, spirals carved into the walls, the floors, the very air seeming to vibrate with the silent language that spoke of an ancient hunger. The creature, or creatures, she no longer knew, no longer cared, had made sure she understood. It was not here to kill, it was here to consume, to unravel everything she knew and everything she was, down to her final breath. It's intelligent, she had told herself over and over, a scientist's mantra to keep the madness at bay. But now that knowledge only made it worse. Intelligence meant it knew how to wait, how to press them slowly toward the edge of their endurance, feeding on their fear, savoring their helplessness. Her mind flashed back to the mission's early days, to Harris's easy laugh, Rowe's reassuring smile, Patel's patient reassurances that they would be remembered as the ones who'd dared to challenge Mars, the ones who might find life. And they had found life. But it was nothing they could study or understand, nothing that could be catalogued in Earth's scientific journals. It was a life that did not want to be known, and they had crossed a line that should never have been touched. The tapping returned, echoing from somewhere deep within the camp. She could almost picture it now, the creature tracing its strange symbols, announcing its presence, each mark a silent taunt. The tapping grew louder, moving toward her, a slow, rhythmic beat, like a predator closing in on wounded prey. Elena forced herself to stand, leaning against the wall to steady her trembling legs. She was exhausted, her eyes heavy with sleepless nights, her mind fraying at the edges. But some small, stubborn spark refused to let her collapse. She'd lost everything, her team, her hope, her very sense of reality. But she would not give this thing the satisfaction of taking her sanity. With her final reserves of strength, she moved to the center of the room, her eyes darting to the shadows around her, half expecting them to shift, to reveal the creature's monstrous form. She could feel it there, just out of reach, lurking in the dark corners of the camp. It was waiting for her to fall, to give in, to succumb to the despair that clawed at her mind. "Is this what you want?" she whispered, her voice rough, cracked. "Is this all just a game?" The silence responded, heavy and merciless, pressing down on her as if in answer. She could almost hear the echo of its alien thoughts, a presence that invaded her mind, coiling around her memories, her fears. She could feel it sifting through her, as if stripping her down to her core, examining her with cold indifference. The emergency lights flickered again, and in that split second of darkness, Elena felt something brush against her leg, a light, barely there touch that sent a shiver crawling up her spine. She stumbled backward, the metal rod raised as if it could protect her from the darkness itself, her eyes wide as she searched for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only shadows, stretching longer and darker, as if reaching for her. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, grating sound, a slow, deep vibration that seemed to seep up from the ground itself, resonating in her bones. She clutched the metal rod tighter, feeling its coldness seep into her skin, grounding her against the rising terror. Her vision blurred as the vibration grew louder, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, an alien pulse that twisted her insides, filling her with a sickening dread. The walls began to pulse with it, each spiral carving seeming to glow faintly, the red light shifting, distorting, as if the camp itself had come alive. Elena staggered back, her gaze darting around as the symbols seemed to close in on her, their silent language screaming into her mind, filling her with thoughts that weren't her own. Images flashed behind her eyes, twisted landscapes, impossible shapes, memories that weren't hers, things she could never understand but somehow feared all the more for it. A low, rasping breath filled the air, a sound so close she could feel it against her skin, like the whisper of a predator's exhale. She could barely breathe, her mind fighting to maintain any sense of coherence, of herself. The thing was everywhere, surrounding her, inside her, tearing at the very fabric of who she was, filling her with its endless, merciless hunger. And then she saw it, emerging from the shadows, its form twisting, shifting, as if refusing to settle into any one shape. It was a mass of dark, writhing limbs, a body that seemed to devour the light, its surface covered in the same spirals etched into the walls. It moved with a deliberate, horrifying grace, inching closer, studying her, as if savoring the final moments before it struck. Elena's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen, unable to look away as the creature leaned in, its face, or what passed for one, a void, a place where her own terrified reflection stared back at her. She saw herself in its depths, a fragile, broken thing, a flickering memory on the edge of oblivion. Some final, desperate instinct forced her to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "Why? Why us?" The creature paused, as if considering her question. She felt it in her mind, a weight that shifted, cold and probing, its alien consciousness brushing against her own in a way that felt like a violation. In that moment she understood. There was no why. There was no meaning, no purpose. This was not a creature born from malice or rage. It was something that existed outside of human comprehension, a force of nature, as inevitable and unfeeling as time itself. It was not here to kill, it was here to reclaim what it believed was already its own. The lights flickered, dimming to darkness, and the creature moved, engulfing her in its shadow. She felt its presence wrap around her, pressing in on her mind, unraveling her thoughts, her memories, her very sense of self. She was drifting, slipping away, dissolving into the darkness, her final breath caught in a scream that never left her lips. As the last remnants of Camp Argos fell silent, the dust began to settle, covering the spirals, the cracks, the faint traces of humanity that had dared to trespass upon this ancient, alien ground. The creature lingered for a moment, as if savoring the emptiness it had left behind, before it retreated into the shadows, disappearing back into the Martian night. Mars lay quiet once more, a barren, indifferent landscape stretching out beneath an endless, starless sky. And in that silence, the planet reclaimed its solitude, its secrets buried beneath the shifting sands, waiting for the next unwary soul who would dare to uncover them. No distress signal would ever reach Earth. No one would know the fate of Camp Argos or of the crew who had vanished without a trace. They would be remembered only as a ghost story, a whispered caution against the arrogance of exploring the unknown. Mars had taken them, absorbed them into its ancient, timeless void, and it would wait in patient silence until humanity's curiosity dared to trespass upon its surface once more.